welcome everyone for the second lecture in our sequence about design in the biodiverse. I don't know if you noticed, but if you look at the speakers, the organization is kind of going from the planetary scale to the, I'll say the species scale, from both ecologists, landscape architects, planners, and architects. And today we're joined by Kristina Hill, who is an associate professor at UC Berkeley, and she studies urban ecology and hydrology in relationship to physical design and social justice. And her primary area of working is in adapting urban districts and shore zones to the new challenges associated with climate change. So Kristina received her PhD from Harvard and was a member of the faculty at MIT, the University of Washington in Seattle, and the University of Virginia before coming to California. So Kristina, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great. So excited to get a chance to talk to you all. I wanted to talk today about how biodiversity and processes are related because I'm trying to connect species to systems. So I'm going to open my slides and hope that we'll be able to see those. Let's see.
Yes, but it's not full screen. Yeah, now it is.
Okay, great. Great. So I wanted to start with an image that has is ambiguous because I want to talk about what the biodiverse is in a series of different ways. So what is the biodiverse? I'm going to start by connecting it to internal systems. When you think about what being human is, we often think of ourselves in some kind of contrast to animals, and we think of ourselves as having a kind of separateness where we could say, okay, this is my body, and that's the biodiverse out there. Lions and tigers and bears, or areas that are protected habitat, whatever they are. But in fact, only 43% of the human body is human cells. So 57% of you sitting there in a chair is not human. So the biodiverse actually dominates your body's environment and its ecosystems. And if you look at it genetically, it's even more dominant. About 20,000 genes define the human genome, but something between 2 and 20 million genes define the human microbiome, which is all these other organisms that live inside us. So maybe we should be asking, who is the biodiverse? If the boundary between ourselves, thinking of ourselves as whos, and other species, which we in English often name what, is really a landscape of different scale organisms. And the illusion is the boundary of our skin between that inner biodiverse and the outer biodiverse. And we've learned that with a respiratory borne disease, that the skin and its separateness from the world, our separateness, is an illusion, thus the mask. And people washing vegetables and all of that. And this is not a new idea. When Mary Shelley wrote the original version of Frankenstein, which is widely considered the first kind of science fiction novel in the 18 teens, she wrote a story about a scientist who assembled a new creature. I shouldn't say human because the language that she used was about a monster that was not a human being, but it was made of human parts. And it was brought to life by electricity, because that was a series of experiments happening at the time with a scientist in Italy named Galvini. And the word galvanize comes from the idea of giving life through a spark of what was essentially electricity. So Frankenstein assembled body parts and shot electricity through it and galvanized life. And I think that it's useful for us to remember the way that that original story talked about who we were in relation to other forms of life. And the story ends tragically, where the monster is angry with Frankenstein for the fact that he created this form of life that had no partner, had no others of its own kind. And the monster ends up killing a series of people who are important to Frankenstein. I would recommend looking back at the original Mary Shelley Frankenstein to think a little bit about biodiversity and the role of humans in shaping biodiversity. How the things we do can kind of come back to bite us. The things we create and the influence that we have. So I want to bring this to cities also and talk about design and the context of cities and places. So I'm showing you this image because it shows human and non-human organisms flowing through a constructed space. It's, of course, the running of the bulls in Pamplona, but it could be a marsh next to a city. It could be the hills next to San Francisco. It could be
where's the strings?
It could be any kind of setting where people and organisms and spaces are all flowing. And I'd like you to try to keep that in mind, that everything I'm going to show you is about change over time, flow through space, and processes that all involve flows. I'm going to start with talking about some of those underlying processes. Of course, this is a fire image. That's an underlying process where fire as a form of energy moves through landscapes and unfortunately also through cities. Sand moved by wind. This is a dune system. It's dynamic, it's flowing, it's always moving. If you tried to put a fence around it, it would cease to function. If you really kept the wind out, the dunes and the organisms that are adapted to dunes wouldn't be able to persist. So processes and flow are essential to ecosystems. They are what gives rise to biodiversity in every way. And I'm going to give you examples of that and try to develop that theme. It is the processes that give rise to the biodiversity. When people show these kinds of images, and maybe you saw some in Richard Weller's talk, where people are talking about taking humans out of parts of the biosphere, the global biosphere that we live in. And in this particular image, Stuart Pym and his co-authors are showing gray areas where humans have the most impact, yellow areas in what they're calling wilderness, which I can tell you is not a thing. There's no wilderness. And then protected areas with green, you're meant to say, oh, wow, that green really should encompass all of the yellow. And then ideally, we'd have half Earth protected from development. But in fact, this is completely wrong-headed to think about drawing boundaries around preserved areas and keeping people out and maybe keeping processes or altering processes. It is like as if you saw this image or this place, you're in this place, a marsh, and you saw an egret, and you said, oh, I think I'll build some walls around that. And then I'll put some other endangered species in there or hope that they show up. We'll be talking about these species in the next couple examples I'm going to give. You cannot have what you want if you build a wall around it and you try to keep some things out and some things in. I'm going to develop this argument and come back to it at the end, that drawing lines around things often blocks the very processes that generate the biodiversity in the first place. One of the most important papers that have come out about this is by Earl Ellis and his colleagues, writing in 2021. They published this in Nature, I believe. And what they're arguing is that people, in fact, are a critical element of all of the biospheres in ecosystems that have biodiversity. And their analysis revealed that only 17% of the Earth has areas where people have not been part of the mix for 12,000 years. So what they're showing in this paper, when they look at the world, they're seeing biodiversity evolving with people for 12,000 years. And the problem isn't the people. The problem, as they put it, is a kind of industrialized extraction economy that takes value out of landscapes and tries to put it into a global market. That's the problem, not the people. So when we talk about people and biodiversity, we really have to put people back into the picture because they are actually part of sustaining biodiversity. And that's true for many traditional societies, not just indigenous, but also traditional. Most of them are pre-industrial, but we have lessons to learn from the way they've sustained biodiversity. So I want to show you a little bit of what's going on in California. I titled this talk about biodiversity being on fire because we're so aware here in California now of the way that we could call them wildfires because they're often started by lightning, but in fact, they're really a mix of human processes and natural processes spreading fire directly through our landscapes. And a lot of that has been because humans have suppressed fire for so long. So we live in a world in California where people have started to worry about the way that these massive fires affect biodiversity. And most people think of that in terms of the injury to biodiversity of the fire. They think about pictures like this is a bobcat that's been injured in a fire, and think of fire as bad. And that led us to a program of suppressing fire for 100 years in the North American landscape, in the United States in particular. And in places where we've suppressed fire, we've actually reduced biodiversity and in interesting ways. This is an image from Florida National Wildlife Refuge, where it's just showing the kind of change over time from an era when a moment when a fire occurs throughout the regrowth of vegetation back to a state that looks more like the pre-fire condition at the top. And what I'm trying to trigger in your mind looking at this series of images is that fire increases habitat diversity, and habitat diversity is a very, very important component of species richness, the number of species. So I'm going to try to break down biodiversity a little bit into talking about this component of biodiversity, which is habitat diversity, versus counting the number of species. Habitat diversity is created by pyrodiversity, by the diversity of the size and frequency and seasonality of fire. When fires occur of different sizes over and over again, over time, during different seasons, you get different plants growing, in this case, the California poppy, with a native pollinator, native bee from California. When insects live in environments where there's a lot of habitat diversity, especially in fire-prone landscapes, if there's a looser relationship between pollinator and flowering plants, those pollinators increase in diversity. Those insects that do the pollination increase in diversity in areas where there's been a diversity of the size, seasonality, and frequency of fire. So fire generates habitat diversity in the species of plants, and then those plants can support a higher diversity of pollinators. Habitat diversity in California also supports different kinds of bird species that benefit from something as simple. I'll give you the example of, in the lower right corner image, you can see the dead trees left after a fire. The bird on the left, the black-backed woodpecker, immediately benefits from dead trees because insects come to those dead trees, and the woodpecker uses its strong beak and skull to hammer into the wood and get those insects. But the chestnut-backed chickadee has no such hammering beak. So it has to wait until the trees, the standing dead trees, start to rot, and woodpeckers have had a chance to make holes in them, and then the chickadees can use those trees as habitat. So over time, different species come into the mix once fire has created habitat diversity. And over time, even though initially you may see a decrease in the species richness, over time, you're going to see an increase and a change in which species benefit. And a lot of species' ability to take advantage of those habitat mosaics created by fire diversity or flooding is because of traits. So now I'm going to introduce trait diversity. I've talked about habitat diversity, species diversity, and trait diversity. Trait diversity is what we'd normally think of as genetic diversity within a species. So one bird may have a slightly longer beak than another, or be better at hammering into that dead tree's bark than another. Just like a human being, one of us may be taller and one of us shorter and one of us longer arms or need less sleep, partly from genetic diversity. Trait diversity is the kind of diversity that is most closely linked to ecosystem function and performance. If I want to remove pollutants from water, trait diversity is what's been correlated with the ability of plants to remove contaminants from water, not species diversity. So trait diversity has actually been shown to be quite important, and in some cases more important than species diversity to change ecosystem function. And in this case, in California, this is an image from the California Sierra Nevada mountains. When fire creates habitat diversity, it also creates more meadows. And in meadows, we see 20 to 30% higher soil moisture because the trees aren't using that moisture and because snow accumulates in the meadows and contributes to soil moisture as it melts. That soil moisture in those fire-prone meadows means that there'll be more water in these streams that become rivers that provide water supply for San Francisco, Berkeley, all of us living out here. So the pyrodiversity and the habitat diversity and the plant diversity actually produces water that humans use, and not in big flashy flood events. It's a steady supply of water. So it benefits people in that way, as well as any other species that rely on water. So having fire diversity, underlying process, produces habitat diversity, supports species diversity, and benefits from trait diversity in producing ecosystem services like having more clean water available across a longer period of the year after the snow melts. So I'm going to give more examples like this, but I'm trying to build a case here. This is an image from Western Australia where they're talking about fire in a very different, more of a grassland context. And this particular paper talks about pyrodiversity, the types of fire and the timing of fire and the size of fire, producing landscapes that are actually more attractive for humans to go and forage in. And I'm pointing this out, this relationship with the Australian paper, because humans would start fires to make landscapes more attractive to them as opportunities to gather food and other resources. So unlike situations where in a kind of, colonial diaspora, there'll be a group of humans in one area and they'll use resources and then move on. Humans using fire as a management process actually creates a landscape that's more attractive for those same people to stay in and use over time. And it's when colonialism pushes those people off that land and takes away their opportunity to manage it in a way that produced resources, that's when that land becomes unattractive for humans. The removal of the people doing the management makes the landscape less attractive because humans played a role in that pyrodiversity, as they did here in California. And more recently are coming back to play a role in that pyrodiversity, where in this image, we see a Native American doing a prescribed burn sanctioned by the state of California in the area around Sebastopol here in Northern California. And these prescribed burns are done according to cultural traditions. So the return of those cultural traditions and control over landscape by indigenous people is central to the recreation of biodiversity and the support of existing biodiversity here in California. And you'll find that that's true in many colonized landscapes, colonized by human empires. Decolonization and biodiversity go hand in hand when we return the control of land to native people who bring back cultural practices like prescribed burning. So my point here, leaving the fire example and going on to the next one, is that processes that generate and support biodiversity, fire diversity can increase biodiversity, cultural practices can actually increase pyrodiversity, so that's what underlies this. And then pyrodiversity increases habitat diversity, species diversity, and trait diversity. So biodiverse has lots of different meanings, but processes and humans have to be part of the mix to sustain the kinds of species that have evolved over the last 20,000 years and longer. I'm going to give you another example now from the dryland hills of California. This is right outside the area where I live and work. This is in Orinda, California. We're going to talk about a disease organism, not COVID-19, but Lyme disease, something that's very common in New York State. I'm sure all of you know somebody who's been bitten by a tick and maybe has gotten Lyme disease. There are a lot of consequences of Lyme disease. It's very serious, especially untreated. It's got systemic implications once it enters the human organism. Outside the human organism, the article that I sent for Julia to share with you all from a magazine called Bay Nature talks about why it is that California has less Lyme disease than New York State. And one of the reasons we have less Lyme disease is that we have predators like lions, cougars, that eat deer. And cougars eat a lot more deer than the public hears about. Nobody wants to tell every time a deer is eaten because a lot of people in the public think of deer as vulnerable and needing protection and might see cougars in a more negative light if they heard every time they kill a deer. But it's pretty common that cougars eat deer. So those cougars eating deer have an impact on the deer's ability to be a vector for the disease from one area to another. It's not that the deer has Lyme disease, it's that it's carrying a tick that has the bacillus that gives humans Lyme disease and other animals. So deer are a vector. Dusky-footed wood rats and western gray squirrels are also vectors. They actually get Lyme disease and they can pass it on when a tick bites them. So the tick can get the disease from these animals as well as give it to them. Other predators like gray fox and bobcat eat those dusky-footed wood rats and gray squirrels, so they can limit the spread of the disease by limiting the populations of those small mammals. The diversity of those small mammal populations, mice, voles, shrews, here in California is significantly higher than the diversity of native small mammals and rodents in New York State. And scientists out here think that that diversity may be one of the reasons why Lyme disease doesn't spread as much. Not only are the deer limited in their movements, but the diversity of the small animals that get Lyme disease is they're limited in their movements by these smaller predators, and their diversity changes the way that the disease passes from ticks to animals. Now, I apologize, it's a little bit gross, the other image here on the right. The one on the left is this kind of miraculous animal called the western fence lizard, which is ubiquitous and very common here. It turns out that when ticks, and those are ticks on the right, sorry, when they bite the western fence lizard, it neutralizes the Lyme disease bacillus. It kills Lyme disease. It causes ticks that have been infected with Lyme disease to be uninfected. So when a tick with Lyme disease bites a fence lizard, Lyme disease in that tick goes away and it can't pass it on to other organisms like people. That's another factor in why Lyme disease is less common here than it is on the East Coast. So I have students make these kinds of diagrams using software called Loopy, where we look at how all this works. And I'm going to show you a quick version of how this works. I'm going to decrease the habitat diversity in a suburban part of California. And as this plays, humans with Lyme, the number increases, that yellow circle gets bigger, and the number of infected ticks is increased. Next, I'm going to stop this model from playing. This is a system with lots of species in it, and I'm going to increase habitat diversity. So if I increase habitat diversity, the way I've set up this model, now the number of humans with Lyme and the number of infected ticks goes down. Because of all of the players in this model that I just described to you. Now suppose I play this model by simply increasing patch fragmentation, cutting up our grasslands and woodlands into smaller patches. I get more humans with Lyme and more infected ticks. If I turn that off and go back to decreasing patch fragmentation, just playing this out as a system, and I get fewer humans with Lyme and fewer infected ticks. So this is how species fit into a system. This is a very simple modeling tool, not very complex at all, but it lets us represent things like the size of the mountain lion population. And when the mountain lion population is increased, you see there can still be an increase in humans with Lyme or infected ticks, but it's a smaller increase. Habitat diversity and habitat fragmentation actually has a bigger impact in this model than in other models. But when the number of mountain lions goes down, you actually can see that humans with Lyme and infected ticks goes up. So this is an example of trying to connect species to systems in an important way. Let me come to, whoops, I think I'm playing this over again. So the point I want to make with that example of biodiversity and disease spread is that processes generate and support biodiversity. Again, biodiversity can decrease the spread of disease. There's a good argument for biodiversity if I've ever heard one. Of course, fragmentation and other activities can change the way that diseases move. So if we want diseases to move less freely, we need a more complex mosaic of different habitats, and we need more top predators who can actually limit the spread of those vectors like the deer. So humans have to share space with mountain lions. We have to share space with wolves. We have to share space with top predators in order to see less movement of disease organisms through our ecosystems. And as you know, that is a global phenomenon. And what happens in China and what happens in Africa and what happens here in the United States, many epidemiologists think that the 1918 flu started in the United States, even though we call it the Spanish flu to divert blame and attention away from the state of Kansas and the actions of the United States population. So the spread of disease is a global phenomenon, but it's also local. And it comes right down to habitat for bats and pyrodiversity that limits the kinds of habitat that are available or increases it, mimics a historic evolutionary kind of environment, and then, of course, the presence of top predators that can limit the spread of disease. Humans have tried to mimic the behavior of top predators in places like Yellowstone, where we hunted deer and hunted elk to try to mimic the behavior of top predators, and it doesn't work. In fact, when top predators are present, different things happen. So let me give you an example of a predator-prey relationship that generates biodiversity in a different landscape. I'm going to use this idea of how systems change over time, and really it's been present in all of the examples I've talked about so far. It's from a paper by Sheffer et al. From 2012. And the concept is, how does change occur in systems? Some people are calling systems, modelers are calling this regime shifts. What they're showing in the top two diagrams is that in a more disconnected system with more disconnected pieces, more heterogeneous, more habitat diversity, more species diversity, change can happen more slowly because the system is more resilient to that change and it bumps its way down in little changes incrementally. And on the right, what we're seeing is a more homogeneous system where everything is very connected. And in that kind of system, change can happen suddenly before anybody has time to adjust to it. And that kind of sudden change in a highly connected, homogeneous system can be disastrous. So what we're talking about here in this diagram is any kind of change. This is generic, but I'm going to show you an example that's specific again. I just wanted to point this out as a way to think about change in systems, that diversity actually allows change to be more gradual if the system becomes more resilient as a result of that diversity, habitat, species, traits, and underlying processes. So I'm going to show you an example from a tidal marsh system in California, where in this example, in this slightly blurry, sorry, photo, the escarpment or the face of the tidal marsh is falling apart. This is what we expect to happen from sea level rise and from increased wave energy, but it's also falling apart because there's an animal that burrows into the face of the marsh. That's this animal. It's a lined crab. It's native to California, and the population of the lined crab explodes when a top predator that's common to California marshes, or used to be, disappears. Here's an example of an exclosure experiment where ecologists have built this fence around tidal marsh, the vegetation, in this case, pickleweed. On the left, the pickleweed is enclosed in the fence. On the right, it's open to predation by crabs. So not only do they eat the vegetation of the marsh, but they burrow into the edge of the marsh and cause it to collapse. So they have two big important influences on the health and resilience of tidal marshes, which maybe you know, maybe you don't know. Tidal marshes are being built in the California area and other parts of the country to reduce wave energy and protect humans from flooding. So we count on these tidal marshes, and they're falling apart because of this native crab in some cases. This is a researcher who's making a joke in the Elkhorn Slough about algae. Algae come in the tidal marsh areas from excess nutrients flowing in from agriculture and from cities. And this algae is produced when nitrogen and phosphorus increase in the water of the marsh. It's pretty scary, and generally it kills the kind of vegetation that supports biodiversity. This is the Elkhorn Slough context. There's a lot of agriculture around it. And you can see a little bit of tidal marsh up here in the upper third or so of the image. This organism, the sea otter, eats those crabs. So when sea otters are present, researchers in the Elkhorn Slough have noticed a reduction in the crab population. So that's really important for lots of reasons. The roads around the Elkhorn Slough actually function as something of a barrier for the movement of these sea otters. So humans, unfortunately, have a negative impact on the movement of sea otters and the spread throughout California's wetlands. In fact, in the 1930s, sea otters were limited to a very small kelp bed habitat area off of Big Sur, and there are only about 50 individual sea otters left. Since the 1930s, the sea otter population has re-expanded to about 3,000, but sea otters almost went extinct. We'd like to see that population expand because they have an impact not only on the tidal marsh vegetation and the scarp of the marsh where crabs burrow, but also on eelgrass beds. Eelgrass beds, and this is an example of an eelgrass bed underwater, and this is a biologist studying an eelgrass bed at low tide. You can see all the hair-like grasses in there. Eelgrass beds are like the tropical rainforest of the subtidal world. They provide habitat where small fish can hide from big fish. They are one of the primary habitats that support biodiversity in the coastal environment. This little creature is called a Taylor's sea hare. It's foraging on a blade, a single blade of eelgrass. And if you look from right to left, it's moving from right to left. You can see that it's like a little lawnmower eating the algae that's covering the eelgrass blade. The Taylor's sea hare were less numerous when there were more crabs, because the crabs also eat Taylor's sea hare. So when there are too many crabs, you don't have the lawnmowers taking the algae off the blades of seagrass. So you get death of the seagrass meadows in the subtidal world. And you had the crabs eating the tidal marsh grasses and plants like pickleweed, and you had the crabs burrowing into the face of the marsh. So you can see it starts to all be a big connected picture again. That's very important for understanding why sea otters are so important. This sea otter was present in a more urban area in San Francisco Bay for a few months and couldn't tolerate the low water quality in the bay. That's the sea otter floating there in the foreground, next to a popular bike trail in Marin County near Sausalito. So in order for sea otters to continue to expand and be the predator that supports these incredibly biodiverse ecosystems, we need to clean up the water that's going into the bay. So there are things humans can do and have to do in order to allow that to spread. But I want to point out at the end of this little story, keystone predators can increase biodiversity. And sea otters are one example. There are so many examples of the way that predators play a role and help us understand why we need to share space with animals that we might find scary. And I want to come back to that point about the global scale with that again. So humans and large predators have to coexist in order for processes to continue, and we can't wall off these big spaces to make that happen. We have to imagine humans living in these yellow and green areas as well as the gray, but maybe not with extractive market-based industries. And as we go back to thinking about the point of, what it means to be human, when only 43% of your cells are actually human cells that support your body, you're literally being galvanized by biodiversity. The only reason you can live is because of this 57% of those others of your total number of cells, which are not human. We really should be representing it a little more like this, where we combine the body with the biodiverse and blur the boundary between what's human and what's non-human, and start thinking about this all as relationships. It sounds a little trite, but it is in fact what Donna Haraway has called kin making, and what traditional societies tell us is kin making. We have to see ourselves as related to all the other species and aware of how permeable our visual sense tells us that our bodies are distinct from the environment around us, but our visual sense is misleading us. It's lying, it's an illusion. In fact, we're part of that whole exchange. The sea otter, the fire, the spread of disease, all of this is something that penetrates us and with which we have to establish relationships. And I want to end with a reference to some mythical stories. One, a very ancient mythical story. I like to, show people sometimes these older images of Medusa. Probably you've all heard of the story where there's a Greek hero who kills her, cuts her head off and it's all very dangerous because she can turn people into stone by just looking at them. Medusa was an underworld or the word for underworld in a Greek root is chthonic. She's a monster. She's been treated very badly, and she's often represented as angry. In fact, contemporary images, and I think I have one here. This is a Roman image. So this older one, the first one I showed you, is from 400 BC. She doesn't look that angry. She looks kind of like a trickster to me. You know, okay, she's got the fangs going on, but she's got her tongue out and she's sort of grimacing, sort of smiling. And she's clearly connected to these snakes. It's scary because of the way the story has been told to us. And certainly in later representations, it's made to look more scary. This one has dark circles under her eyes and looks a little more intense and a little more freaky. By only 250 of the Christian or current era, 250 years, what some people would call AD. And she's made much more scary in contemporary representations, but Medusa got a raw deal. She somehow ran afoul of a goddess, Athena, by possibly having a sexual relationship, which apparently was coerced, with another god, a male god. So she's essentially raped by a male god. Athena is angry and treats her this way, converts her into a scary, angry female figure that turns men into stone, that punishes men. It's a complicated story, as you can imagine. There's a lot of gender relationships going on here. Yes, Medusa is scary, but she's also clearly entangled. She's part of a larger world of relationships between the sexes, between humans and gods, between an underworld of gods and Mount Olympus. There are lots of worlds represented here, and the snakes in her hair are a representation of that entanglement, something else that Donna Haraway brings up in her discussions of what it means to be living in our time. And she writes that we're not really in an Anthropocene, we're in what you might call a Medusa scene. We're in an era of entanglement. And the other famous story about that is science fiction by H.P. Lovecraft, where he's writing in the 1920s, living in the city of Providence, Rhode Island, about an underworld monster. Again, I notice a theme, I hope you are also, an underworld monster that lives in an underwater city somewhere in the South Pacific and emerges from its underworld city and grabs human ships. And it's considered a monster, but it also is considered a representation of our own human anxieties. And that's the way the monster's actions in the story play out, kind of like Frankenstein's monster. It's a representation of our own anxieties. And I wanted to kind of leave you with that thought because when we think about the biodiverse, and we know that it's inside us, and we know that it's outside us, and that we know that these boundaries we have and that we guard so carefully in our social world are an illusion within the biodiverse, I think it's an open question. What and who is the biodiverse? What cultural lenses should we look at it through? We can look at myth, we can look at contemporary storytelling and filmmaking. We can talk about it through different cultural lenses. Native Americans, indigenous people all over the world, and traditional societies, many of which populate that environment with anthropomorphic, so creatures that look like us but aren't us, that we have to negotiate and build relationships with. Build our sense of who our relatives are. So if you read Donna Haraway, and it's not easy, read Donna Haraway and read interpretations of Donna Haraway and start asking, who do we live with? And what is right behavior? What is good way to live and to design in a world that is so diverse, internally and externally? And I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
Wow. That's great. Do you want to close your screen so we can see your face? There we go. Thank you so very much. I'm sure there will be questions, but while the students and others are forming them, I have a question for you. And you were hinting at it here at the end, but you teach in a school of environmental design. And I'm wondering, do you have optimism that the design and planning fields can have any agency relative to designing through systems in the way that you've outlined? Because, I think it's really interesting. I think we're seeing a lot of work in architecture specifically that is species specific, let's say, relative to the making of objects that engages other beings. But can you think of like real planning measures being done at this, thinking through the system scale?
Yeah, well, I mean, the San Francisco Bay Area is the world's largest experiment in wetland restoration, wetland reconstruction. And we're doing it for our own sake, to protect ourselves from wave energy. And we're doing it for the sake of this biodiverse. And we see it as a way to limit the spread of disease and, in a sense, buffer ourselves. So we're building a sense of cities as layered. There's certain kinds of biodiversity that can exist in the most developed parts of cities. Falcons that eat pigeons. There are so many predator-prey relationships that can exist. Coyotes are traveling right through the downtowns of cities at night. In other countries, India, there are various primates that are fed by people in cities, and that's done for ethical and religious reasons that extends our relationship to other species. I think that everything we do in design is affecting the way these underlying processes work and helping to reveal to us. Maybe that's one of the central roles that in dense city environments that designers can play, is to reveal what's going on. But at the edges of our cities, everything we do is affecting those underlying processes. And that could be the wetland edge, that could be the wildland urban interface that fire comes through, that could be the area where ticks bite people, where they go walking, or bite dogs and come home with dogs. So everything we're doing is connected. It's actually impossible to not have an effect on the biodiverse by doing design. The trick is to have an intentional effect.
Right. I mean, a positive effect. Well, we can do probably a lot of damage, but in terms of a positive effect. I'm sure there's other questions, but I just want one follow-up, which is, how did it happen? It's not the politicians leading the way, it's public will, right? Public knowledge and public will, and then politicians follow course. So, is it a cultural change where it's really coming from the ground up, that this restoration is happening, for instance, from the voters?
Yeah, it actually is a kind of dance, right? Where activists make something seem appropriate. They make it wantable. They make wetlands from a swamp into something beautiful that attracts birds and bird watchers. And then politicians realize that wealthy people who give them money want to see these wetlands. They start giving more money to the wetland projects. The projects expand, and lower income people get a chance to bike and walk and visit these places. And it's not that, I think it's always a dance between the ecologists, the activists from whatever kind of social group, and the elected officials. And we move in this direction together. And it's like a snowball, it picks up new rationales over time. It picks up the rationale of adapting to sea level rise or of buffering us against disease. But it absolutely cannot exclude humans. It has to be part of a story of relationships.
For sure. So for our questions, you can either just unmic yourself and speak, or you can put them in the chat.
I see 3 people here that I know will have good questions, and among the students, but Catherine and Nina Marie and Jane,
yeah,
people who know as much about this as I do, and I'd love to hear, your comments or questions as well.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Emily.
That was really, really wonderful. I just love I didn't know the fact about the human body being made up of only 43 or 47% of
Human cells.
human. Yeah. So I guess my question though, I like that you ended on the sort of zeros and ones in the array, and wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you think the role and relationship between humans and technology is, and the role that technology and geoengineering might play in the biodiverse. And if you kind of see it as that we've co-evolved, and therefore the technology is as much a part of the biotic sphere as anything else, or not.
Well, I think that some tech, the way we look at technology certainly is just its kind of like habitat forming capacity. So I'm not going to try to talk about all technology altogether, because obviously some of it we don't want, some of it we do. Like with geoengineering, I mean, generating so much CO2 in the atmosphere has already been geoengineering. It's not like geoengineering is a different thing. And I think we need to be careful with those large scale impacts, because largely they've been negative. So the idea of putting up a whole bunch of silver umbrellas into the atmosphere, or dumping megatons of iron ore into the ocean, that kind of stuff has not worked out well for us in the past. So I think the issue is that we need to scale back and look at our relationships in a more local and regional way. And I think we should, frankly, live with some of the changes that we have caused. I mean, we can't hit a switch and stop sea level from rising now.
Right.
We're going to be living with higher water. So we're going to be learning to live with it. And we're going to be focused on underlying processes, not species. So many of the species that live in particular places today that we might focus on because our law, for example, highlights species diversity, we're going to have to talk about as transitional, and give up this whole purist thing about native and non-native, because the species are moving on their own. And we now have to roll with that. So the island that purists live on is going to get smaller and smaller as the world changes faster and faster. And I hope that we'll embrace the idea that, and not fetishize particular species, but focus on the underlying processes that generate habitat diversity and support health and service in so many other ways. I hope that helps a little bit. I'm more focused on the mosaics and watching the mosaics with the underlying processes than I am on any kind of global stuff, because I think our cognitive capacity is not at the point where we can really take in a global scale. We frankly stink at it.
Right.
So if that's the plan, I'm out. I'm not going to participate.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Nina Marie, you have a question or comment.
Oh, well, thank you, Kristina. What a lovely, thoughtful, and illustrative lecture. I thought very difficult to talk about I guess in our ecology language, we would say the alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. And I love the way you framed this around the habitats, the processes that make and shape them. And you've given all of us something to think about from the body outside. The inside-outside relationship is really beautiful and compelling. And there is a question in here, but I wanted to just say first that my students and I this term are working on something very similar. And I have the pleasure of following you, which is why I'm here today. I wanted to help frame what I will say next month and not repeat, but you've given a beautiful place for me to pick up. And that's the work that I'm doing with my students, is interrogating ideas of the sort of what I would call a kind of fortress conservation approach that you've outlined, half the world for others. And we persist in this idea of othering species by appealing to notions of wilderness, which you've also said that you have some difficulty with, I think, as do a lot of us. But on the other hand, in building a kind of relational ecology, I guess in the language of my Indigenous colleagues, we would say all our relations inside and out, is there still a place for the imagination of the wild without othering? How in building a relation with other species could we still, perhaps, especially in design, harness ideas of what is out there without fetishizing? I'm not sure I know the answer to this, and it's taking us a term in class to explore it. So maybe you have some further thoughts on why not the wild, and what about the qualities of wild that might be useful still? Hopefully that's not too garbled a question for.
Well, I think that's great, because this whole idea of wild and othering, wild is only other if we refuse to accept it ourselves, in ourselves. And that's, going a little Jungian on the question, but we are the wild. And one of my Indigenous colleagues, when I was at Iowa State, used to tell me that he's always amazed that Western thinking is missing an important direction. We have our compass directions, we have up, we have down, but he would say that the Lakota had the direction of in. Obviously we have that, but we don't put it at the same level. We treat it like some kind of very personal bathroom topic to talk about going in. But looking at the wild within and embracing that, whether it's that 57% of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and archaea that live in our bodies, or whether it's in our behavior or in our subconscious, the Cthulhu component of human consciousness, I think we have to embrace it. I mean, look what we've done. Look at the way we're transforming the globe unintentionally. That's as wild as it comes. And I wonder whether we'll be able to ever domesticate our tendency to change the earth in unintended ways. I don't know whether we can bring that under the control of culture. And if we can't, then boy, are we wild as a group.
Wise thoughts from a wild woman to carry us forward. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to carrying on the conversation. And thank goodness for Zoom, so we get to do a little bit of that today.
No kidding. It's really great to have you all here. Jane. Hi, Jane.
Hi, it's so nice to see everybody.
I know, it's almost a session of the Bad Girls Club.
Kristina, as Nina Marie said, such a beautiful talk. And I so appreciate the way you're able to bring clarity and structure and simplicity to really complicated topics. And the thing I'm wondering about is the relationship between that kind of clarity and then the mess of the extractive economy. And what I wonder about is how to stop that juggernaut that sees land and landscapes as a kind of infinite hardware store. And I guess I'm wondering about it also in relation to the question of scale, because you're right, like it's impossible to comprehend this stuff globally or to act globally, to have to act locally. Do you feel like you're able to see local action sort of working against extraction? That's a very hard question.
Oh, I think it's, it's the question we're all asking. And we've learned on food systems, for example, that having regional food sources is really, really important. I mean, you know those 100-mile dinners that people talk about planning where you'll eat food from a 100-mile radius. Where I live, that would be exactly the same as going to the grocery store. because the food people are eating is all from 100 miles within where I live. So it's a weird thing to talk about food sheds in California, but at the same time, food sheds are one of the best ways for us to talk about the biodiverse, to talk about that internal biodiverse as well as the biodiverse that we support outside our own bodies. And I think that's a real model for planning regionally, thinking about food. And we can talk about it in terms of resilience to disasters, where supply chains for food are interrupted by hurricanes and other kinds of disasters that affect roadways. So I see it happening, absolutely. And I feel kind of optimistic that we're going to put the pieces together in new ways. But change is always patchy, as we say in landscape ecology. And some places will move more in that direction than others. So I hope all of us feel some agency within our own region to support those efforts and to make sure that we have a greater focus on subsistence. I always wondered, you know, back in the 90s when we talked about climate change, I always wondered what would happen to the oil industry when people started saying, oh, we're not going to use this anymore. And of course, what we see happening is that they're making all kinds of power grabs, both to get the last drops of oil out of the ground and to transition into new industries. So that money, it's like that Cthulhu monster. It's so tentacled, it's so entangled. That capital flows through all of our political and regional and global systems. But I think that by creating mosaics of greater diversity in regions, we can slow the flow and maybe block it, but not all at once. It'll be a slower process and it'll always depend on underlying processes.
I truly appreciate your optimism. I mean, I do. I think that's a great message, right, to all of us and to our students. Catherine, do you want to share anything? Where you have us joining us today?
I'm sorry, I came in partway through your talk, Kristina. I had to present my studios to the accreditation board, so apologize for that. But yeah, I came in on the end. But yeah, I would have loved to see the chat. I see the whole thing. So I'm really sorry. I really love what Nita said about the wild. And your response was of the wild in each of us. There is something to that, but I think that maybe it is a more, I'm going to say, you said Jungian, maybe it is a more philosophical stance, maybe. I think we have to give space for the wild and space for things that we don't right now, because we're so obsessed with singular efficiencies and making like the capital of the world is based on all these bigger networks that are very efficient in some respects, but not at all in others. And I think if you take on the singular efficiencies within our systems in multiple ways, in microwaves, maybe there's a way to break them down, as you're, I think, suggesting. Living with things, making space for things. I don't know, it's not a question, it's just, I'm just talking.
Well, I mean, it's a great tie-in to thinking about decolonization, because what we need to do for decolonization is make space for others to manage these lands and to feel, you know, a sense of return to these lands. And we need to recognize who we are as, I don't know, not everybody on this call maybe, but I'm a settler or colonial person. I came as part of a diaspora, and I think it's time for us to make space for the diversity of human culture within our own social hierarchies of power. And that's starting to happen with the land back movement. So again, I feel like there are things to feel good about that. And if anything, all of us here could be better allies to that movement and find ways to share the mic, to share space, to share time if we can't share space.
Yeah.
And
You know, to that end, to that really wonderful point, you know, is anything like that happening in the restoration of the wetlands in San Francisco? I mean, in terms of management strategies?
no, fire has been the big opening for returning land management to Native people.
Okay.
Land is being given back in wetland areas. And I'm persuading a few people, I'm working on the idea that coastal adaptation should always include land back. So that as we make new spaces, berms of earth or mounds or whatever landforms we're going to use on the coast, that those can be used for a kind of reconsecration of sacred space by Native people. And sometimes that might exclude my being able to go. But I'm good with that.
Yeah, I think it's our turn. So much to think about. I think we're running out of time here.
I think there's
I don't
one
know.
student question though, Julia.
I know we had one, and I need one student question. Come on. I'm gonna have to call on someone from my studio.
Excuse me, Professor. I have a question if it's okay.
Please do. Where are you? Oh, you found, no, please.
Yes, thank you. I was totally blown away by this lecture, and I'm only second year, so I don't know whether this question makes sense. And I listened to a lecture, and it's about like how raccoon dogs are taking over Shanghai and populating the housing estates, and also using like the roads people build and design as their transportation roads during the nighttime, and also how they feed on the, you know, the restaurants leftovers, and also the decorative fishes and the fish ponds in the cities. And you mentioned in your lecture that human is an inseparable like element in the biodiversity, but however, the villain is the industrial economy. And it seems like in that lecture I heard like the industrial economy is fostering a new, a new role or a new system here. And the raccoon dogs in those large cities are even genetically different from those their wild relatives. And you also mentioned in your lecture that human, like by introducing human is like restoring the relationship and having those indigenous people going back to nature and do their management. And so this is a process of restoration. And while in those cities, it seems like instead of restoring the relationship, there are new relationships generating, and in this industrial economy. So I wonder what's your opinion on like this generation of new system, and can we trust nature that they might adapt to what we design and what we build? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to be clear. I'm not advocating for going back to any past state. And the word restoration is just used now to talk about building particular ecosystems, helping them be built, not moving back to some past state. So, for example, here in the Bay Area, we have a tidal marsh grass, Spartina, and it genetically mixed with a Spartina that was brought from the East Coast to help us with erosion in the marshes. The Army Corps brought a plant from the East Coast. Now the two plants combined genetically, they hybridized, and they produced a daughter plant, this hybrid, which is more vigorous than either parent. And that is so beautiful, isn't it? That these things created something new naturally, you know, on their own, without us bringing them into a laboratory, that grows faster and stronger than either of those Spartina grasses at the very moment when we need marshes to be able to grow faster and stronger to keep up with sea level rise. I think that's beautiful and kind of poetic. And yet 95% of that daughter plant has been eradicated from the Bay Area's marshes because it's not native.
Oh.
And native species like the Ridgway's rail, it's a bird that lives in the marsh, makes its nests in this hybridized plant because it likes the slightly stiffer stems. So the few patches that have not been removed can't be removed because an endangered bird lives in them. The whole thing is so dumb. We have to figure out how to embrace this change, and maybe we adjust. It's a little more like bobsled, watching the Olympics these days. Small adjustments, working with the momentum of these systems. That's much more modest and much more appropriate to living in a changing world than trying to block things or wall them off or eradicate them. Just take some of that language out of our vocabulary and start thinking about how we can tweak, adjust, live with these changes. Relationships, build relationships with the raccoon dogs.
Yeah, really good question, Yifan.
Thank you for answering, Professor. Thank you.
All right then. Well, Kristina, I want to thank you so very much. It was very provocative, and I know our students enjoyed it, and I look forward to the rest of the series.
Great, me too. I
Thank
look
you
forward
so
to
much.
coming next month when Nina Marie goes.
Absolutely. Okay, bye
Thanks
everyone.
for the invitation.
Thank you.